Our second reading this morning comes from Mark's Gospel, the 10th chapter. I'm going to begin with verse 32 and read through verse 45. They were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. They were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. He took the 12 aside again and began to tell them what was going to happen to him. And he said, "See, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him and spit upon him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise again." James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What is it that you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with?" They replied, "We're able." Then Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." When the 10 heard this, they began to be angry with James and John. So Jesus called them and said to them, "You know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as their rulers lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. But it is not so among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servants, and whoever wishes to be the first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." This is the word of the Lord. There's several universal truths that are floating around out there. But the one with which I'm the most familiar these days seems to be that kids ask for unreasonable things all of the time. You should hear some of the questions my kids ask me. They're not bad kids. They're not dumb. You're not. These unreasonable questions that they ask of me make perfect sense to them. Perfect sense. And that's why my kids usually look hurt or confused or offended or shocked when the answer that they get from me is no. No. But for crying out loud, one of my jobs as a parent, after all, is to give my kids reality checks from time to time. I love my kids. I want to provide for them. I want to occasionally reward them. But when I get unreasonable requests, it's my job, I believe, to let them down easy and to explain to them why it's not okay to do this, that, or the other. That doesn't make any sense. When life gives a father a teachable moment, he needs to step up and teach. Teach. Not humiliate or embarrass or shame, but to teach. Jesus in Mark 10 is on his way to Jerusalem with the disciples, and he knows exactly where he's going. He knows. He knows exactly what's going to happen to him upon his arrival in Jerusalem. And as our passage begins here this morning, he has just delivered his third prediction of his upcoming passion. And he really, I don't think, could have been any more descriptive of what was about to happen. See, we're going to go to Jerusalem. Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and to the scribes. They're going to condemn him to death. They'll hand him over to the Gentiles. They'll mock him, spit on him, beat him, and kill him. And after 3 days, he'll rise again. It's pretty straightforward. But holding true to form in Mark, this third and final prediction of Jesus' passion is defined by a similar pattern, which is that Jesus predicts, the disciples misunderstand, and then Jesus embraces that teachable moment to nudge his disciples towards the true meaning of discipleship. And this is where I think that you and I need to pay attention this morning. I want to shine the spotlight on these disciples here because I think that the teachable moment that Jesus delivers to the 12 in Mark chapter 10 is dangerously relevant to us today. Teacher, James and John say, we want you to do whatever it is that we ask. Really? We want to sit at your right and your left in glory. That's what we want to do, and we want you to do that for us. The sons of Zebedee, James and John, make this request of Jesus immediately following the prediction of his suffering and death and resurrection. Okay, so stop for a second, and before you roll your eyes and think, those self-centered, dumb disciples, those morons, remember the text from verse 32. They were on the road going to Jerusalem. Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. Now, you're correct in assuming that Mark has painted an overall less than desirable picture of the disciples up until this point. Yes, they tend to be a bit dense. Yes, they tend to be a little selfish. And no, they don't seem to get a whole lot of the points that Jesus throws out at them right away. But check this out. In Mark chapter 10, they're still following him. They're still with him. And we can infer from the text that on this road to Jerusalem, Jesus is the one that has his jaw set firmly, and he's pushing forward with determination. But the disciples, we're told that they're following Jesus with amazement and fear. And you can have different translations of amazement in this text. It could be they're filled with alarm, they were in a daze, they were astonished, filled with awe. But you can't translate them being afraid any other way than they were afraid, period. And so to us, I would think that this would absolutely hint to us that the disciples have at least begun to understand that Jesus was going to be killed in Jerusalem. I think as we read that, that's becoming a little more clear that, yeah, he's going to... But they can't understand why he's going to go to Jerusalem then if he's going to be killed. They're starting to put some things together, the disciples here. And so like Jesus, they sense some impending doom, but unlike Jesus, they have yet to sense a purpose to it. I mean, really, if you're going to get killed once you go there, let's not go there. Think about your walk of faith for just a moment. Is it strong? Is it weak? Does it come with conditions? The disciples were definitely on the same road as Jesus, following him, but they were walking a little aimlessly, and they were walking with anxiousness, and as they walked, they were completely scared to death. But again, they were still following Jesus. And it's on this road, after this third prediction of the Passion, that James and John make this unreasonable request. We're headed to Jerusalem, and it sounds like it's not going to be too great for you, Jesus. But hey, could we sit on your right and left in glory? This audacious question asked by their brothers amplifies the reality that they really had not yet fully grasped the understanding of the call Jesus had given them. They hadn't quite grasped that. Give us whatever we want, Jesus. Gimme, gimme. Come on, Jesus. Give it to me. You know, interestingly enough, back in Mark 9, verse 36, Jesus had taken a child and set the child before his disciples as a model for how their attitudes and actions and faith should be. And now, instead of following Jesus with a simple childlike faith, James and John are using a childlike strategy to manipulate Jesus to their own advantage. It was an unreasonable request. They were asking for places at the right and left of Jesus, meaning that despite their fear and anxiousness on this road to Jerusalem, they obviously believed that perhaps this pilgrimage would end in glory. They missed the point that the journey was to the Passion. This was not a pilgrimage. At the end of this road, there would be robbers and thieves on the left and the right of Jesus. His crown, his glorious crown, would be made of thorns, and his throne would be a cross. And the irony here is thick. Keep thinking about your own walk of faith. What are the things that you assume? What are the things that you expect? How willing are you to place your life directly into the hands of Jesus? Despite Jesus' early rebuke of Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," despite Jesus' teaching of denying self and taking up one's cross and losing one's life, despite his rebuke of the argument over who will be the greatest by using a child as an example, and despite Jesus' words about being last and servant of all, James and John were apparently still dreaming about the coming glory and were therefore scheming for a position of privilege. Despite all of this, and beyond James and John, though, in verse 41, we find out that the other 10 disciples are not very happy. They became angry with James and John. It says, indignant. Turns out the remaining 10 disciples, well, they wanted those seats for Jesus too. That's where they wanted to be. And so finally this teachable moment from Jesus comes. It was an inappropriate request at the time, yes. And yes, the jealousy and the anger from the other 10 was wrong and misguided. But in this instance, I find it interesting that Jesus doesn't rebuke them. He asks, "Can you drink from my cup? Can you endure my baptism?" And of course, they both answer, yes. Yes, we can, as a matter of fact. Thank you. There's no rebuke from Jesus. Instead, he accepts their answers, but he promptly turns those answers right side out. You see, the disciples believed that sharing the cup and the baptism meant to share in the glory of Jesus. But Jesus quickly tries to break that connection. He affirms the cup, but he suggests the cup that appears in Mark 14:36. "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I want, but what you want." He affirms the baptism, but he suggests the baptism from Romans 6, chapter 6, verse 3. "Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ were baptized into his death?" Jesus, in a teachable moment, denies their request, but at the same time tells them that his idea of cup and baptism were the only means of fellowship with him and the only way to follow him. Now herein lies the relevance to us today. Jesus accepts the disciples as they were, but he simultaneously and firmly pointed them in a new direction, the direction in which he was really going. He invited the disciples to be like him. Verse 45, "For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." And he's clearly talking about himself there, but he's also thinking about what the disciples should become. These are the things that you ought to be doing also. If Jesus was a servant, how much more ought his disciples be servants? Think about this. Even though the disciples were depicted as slow learners and ambitious and selfish, they were still following Jesus. Their relationship with Jesus was imperfect. Yes, but it was also unbroken. The text doesn't excuse the disciples at all, but it also doesn't reject them either. And that's great news for us, because it invites us to identify with these 12. We can identify with 12 stumbling followers of Jesus. Do we always get it right? Do we always understand who Jesus calls us to be or where he calls us to go? Do we have a true understanding of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ 100% of the time? I mean, we can all sit here this morning and roll our eyes at how stupid the disciples were here again in Mark 10. But at least these dummies were perceptive enough to be alarmed and afraid of what was happening at the time. You know, the gospel today is often presented to us as a no-risk offer. It's often presented to us as, well, you probably ought to follow Jesus just so you can stay out of trouble. However, today's teachable moment from this text, in the midst of all our unreasonable requests and our ideas about discipleship, it offers us a shocking challenge. Getting right with God by coming to Jesus is not simply a basic factor in an orderly life. True discipleship will mean more trouble for us, not less. True discipleship is characterized by the costly pouring out of our lives for one another. Did I mention it will be more trouble and not less? Because we need to hear that. Jesus came to serve and to give his life for us. And according to Mark, anyone who contemplates following Jesus without fear and trembling doesn't understand the true nature of discipleship. This text suggests the imitation of Christ as a pattern for discipleship. Discipleship means a life of service. Forget who's sitting on the right or the left. Discipleship means that those who follow Jesus will be called to pour out their lives for others, just like he did. This is that teachable moment. We've all had misguided ideas about what it means to live out a life of faith. It's confusing. We've all had misguided ideas of wanting to be rewarded for our choice to follow Jesus. We've all had unreasonable requests of Jesus. We've all been comfortable in our pews. Jesus did not rebuke James and John for their boneheaded request. Instead, he gently nudged them towards the true meaning of discipleship. And in response to our unreasonable requests that seek rewards or comfort or an easy path, he nudges us too without rebuke. Consider 1 John 3:16. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. And here 1 John 4:11 also, beloved, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. The passage from Mark that we read this morning, well, that passage helps us to see ourselves as who we are. But these passages from 1 John this morning help us to see what we may become in a response to Jesus when we become servant to all. Amen.